Do a thought experiment with me. Imagine you live in the first century. You've known Jesus of Nazareth. Imagine you're one of that inner circle of his followers. You've seen him. You've watched what he does. You've listened to him teach and interact with people. Maybe even you've seen the cross and the resurrection. You've seen the risen Jesus, and you are convinced this is someone everybody needs to know about. How would you convince somebody else? How would you explain to somebody else who this Jesus is? It doesn't sound like it's enough to say he was a cool religious teacher or a rabbi. People have seen plenty of religious teachers and rabbis. You want to convey something of the like universal glory and power with Jesus, but you don't want to connect him to like the Roman Empire. You don't want to say he's like a new Caesar. That sounds terrible. You want to connect him to the ancient promises of the long-awaited Messiah or Christ, but on the other hand, the kings that ancient Israel and Judah had that led to the hope of a Messiah, they had always left something to be desired. In fact, the last time ancient Judah had a king, the Babylonians came knocking, decided they didn't like the king they had, plucked him up captive and took him kidnapped back into Babylon along with his family and put in a new puppet ruler who they liked better. And when the Babylonians decided they didn't like that guy, they killed him as well. A pretty miserable track record for past kings. You don't want to connect Jesus with the memory of those people, really. You don't even really just want to say, well, he's like Moses, because Jesus doesn't really act like a guy giving new commandments or rules, does he? How do you explain, if you were one of those first followers of Jesus, how do you explain what Jesus means to you and to the world? How would you get through to people to start to tell your story, to get them to want to listen to the rest of the story of Jesus? Well, if you're the writer of the fourth gospel, who we call John, he does something completely outside of the box. He starts with a poem, with a song. He doesn't start with, let me give you a genealogy of all the people who were in Jesus' family tree. He doesn't give us, here are the people in the Roman Empire and the kings at the time that Jesus is born, like Luke does. He doesn't start off with just like, bam, here's Jesus, and start giving us stories about him the way Mark's gospel does. John starts with a poem, with a song, kind of, that deliberately echoes the opening words of the first book of the Hebrew scriptures of Genesis, the creation story, right? So John begins with this amazing poetic imagery. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This grabs people's attention, right? For people who knew the storytelling of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew scriptures, who knew the opening lines of the Genesis poem, they would be like, I've heard this before, but now you're saying something new. For those who spoke the language of Greek philosophy and knew the idea of there being this divine, transcendent logic, logos, word that ordered all creation, this connected with them. For people who were just wondering why an itinerant Jewish rabbi has anything to do with the whole universe, John starts in a way that gets their attention and says, the story I'm telling isn't just about one person who walked the streets of Judea and Galilee for a few years in Palestine, but this Jesus is somehow connected with the God who creates all things. In fact, that somehow this Jesus is one with the divine power by which God made everything and then chose to come to be with us. It's a surprising and spectacular and poetic and beautiful way of getting people's attention. And again, it's like nothing anybody else expected. In all four of the Gospels we have in our New Testament, John's stands out for how weird and different it is. All the other three, we sometimes call them the synoptics because they are so similar. Synoptic meaning seeing with the same eye. In other words, they share a perspective. Matthew and Mark and Luke, they try as much as possible to, in their own ways, to say, let me show you evidence from history of who Jesus is. And they'll either give you historical documents or current events going on at the same time as Jesus, or they'll connect Jesus to firm predictions and prophecies of ancient Israel's prophets. And instead, John, the poet, the creative type, says, no, if you want to know the story of Jesus, let me take you back to the beginning of everything. That opening poem that we sometimes call the prologue of John's Gospel is what our new Bible study starting on Thursdays is going to take a look at. You probably know a lot of the stories in John's Gospel and even some verses. A lot of church folk know by heart John 3:16, for God so loved the world. There are lots of stories that come later in John's Gospel that just sort of sound just like Sunday school Jesus Bible story, right? That are shared in common with Matthew or Mark or Luke. But the opening 18 verses, the opening prologue is unique and different and feels like it's worth a deeper dive on our own. So join us this Thursday and join us for the next 4 sessions as we take a deeper dive into the poetry and theology of what's going on when John begins his storytelling of Jesus with, "In the beginning was the Word." We hope that this will be a valuable time for you, whether you can join us around the table at 1 o'clock on Thursdays or catch up with these video summaries along the way. But either way, we hope you also will be drawn to get to know who this Jesus is and why he matters, not just to a handful of people 20 centuries ago, but to all creation. See you then.